Hey Mzansi and everyone connecting from elsewhere in the world. I'm Donumdu, editor at Food for Mzansi, and welcome to Food for Mzansi TV. Now, over the past few weeks, I've been joined by Bertie Haman, the senior manager for agribusiness at Standard Bank, and he joins me again today to share some sound business and financial advice. And believe me when I say it's not only for farmers and agripreneurs. I've been benefiting as well. I'm not good with finances, but Bertie's here to help us get through it and just take us through the step-by-step things that we need to do to know if we are starting our own business or if you're farming or if you have an agribusiness running currently. Hey Bertie, it's great to have you back on Food for Mzansi TV. How have you been?
Hi Don, hi to all the viewers out there. I'm great. It's a privilege for me to be here, and yeah, let's discuss some interesting thoughts today.
In our last engagement, we talked about understanding the difference between profit versus cash. And next up, we're talking about variable expenses. Bertie, maybe we can start with what is a variable expense?
Thanks, Don. Yes, we're going to be talking about variable expenses and actually then introduce a concept which I refer to as the variable expense trap as well. Now, I think maybe just to set some context first, I think within the field of management accounting and financial decision making, financial managers have got different types of expenses which they refer to. These can, for example, be fixed expenses or variable expenses. We also talk about relevant expenses and irrelevant costs, and then sunk costs as well. So there's different concepts here, and all these different expense types have got different applications. And to be very honest, if you're not a financial fundi, these concepts can be very confusing as well. So I think for our purposes today, we're going to be focusing on the variable expenses and the opposite of a variable expense, which is, of course, a fixed expense. So let's focus on variable expenses and then, the fixed expenses. Now, if I can maybe explain to you, and I'm going to be starting off with what we refer to as a fixed expense. Let's say, for example, you have to store all your pesticides for the season, and you think you're going to be renting a warehouse for 5,000 Rand a month. Now, eventually, even if you end up not even storing any of your pesticides in the warehouse, you will still have to pay your expense of 5,000 Rand per month. Now, this is referred to as a fixed expense because you have to pay this irrespective, right? Now, the opposite is the variable expense. And here I'm going to be using the example of your electricity bill, for example. Now, you are supposed to be billed for your electricity based on the actual usage. So, if you don't use any electricity, you're not supposed to have any electricity expense. So, this is a variable expense. You pay for it based on what you've actually used. Now, I suppose the concepts of variable expenses and fixed expenses are fairly simple then to understand from that perspective. But farming, like in all other businesses, is not always that simple. So astute farmers have to be very acutely aware of what I refer to as the variable expense trap.
And what is the variable expense trap exactly?
So this is a concept or something that I use to explain to farmers and business people dangers and also the possibility that expenses that you think is variable can actually be a bit more fixed than what you think. In other words, you think you can change it later on in the season, and for whatever reason, then you can't do so. And we, in the previous episode, said that you will have to have an objective that you want to achieve for the season. Now, once you start on your journey towards your objective for your season, you actually fix all your expenses. So while you think you can still change it at a later stage, you cannot. And maybe just as a side comment, and I think this is just maybe just to take note of, financial managers actually refer to something which they call the degree of operating leverage. And this is, your fixed expenses versus your variable expenses. And the more fixed expenses you have, the more higher will be your operating leverage. And financial managers use this to their benefit. But if you are not an expert financial person, this is actually quite a dangerous thing to do. So we are going to go out from a point that, the more variable expenses you have, the better it is. Now, with that context in mind, let's move back to our example that you are a maize farmer and you want to plant 500 hectares of maize and you want to achieve a yield of 4.5 tons per hectare. Now, the moment that you set out for your objective, which you've just now set, you prepare your production budget, as I said, you're actually fixing all your expenses. Now, if you have your objective and you set your objective too high, you are too bullish about your objective, the danger is that you are actually sort of fixing your expenses at this high objective. And if you don't, for whatever reason, end up making your objective, you will still have all those expenses to pay for. And that is then what I refer to as the variable expense trap. Now, competent farmers will know from experience what seed density to plant, how much fertilizer to give, how much pesticide they must apply, how much fuel they will be using. And all these expenses must be paid for at the beginning of the season, right? So if you set your objective at the wrong level, like I said, you're actually fixing all those expenses up front. So it is generally wrong to assume that a lot of the farming expenses are variable. I'm contending that most of the farming expenses are actually fixed, at least for the specific season. So the trap is if you set your objective at the wrong level, you're actually tying in all these expenses.
You've just highlighted some of the things that farmers can do to avoid the variable expense trap. Is there any other examples about how they can do this, Bertie?
Yes, I can, Dawn. I can offer a couple of tips, I think, for the viewers out there. The first thing, of course, which I've now just stressed, is have a very realistic objective. In other words, have an objective that you actually think you can achieve, because then you tie up all your expenses around that, which is a better position to be in. I think the next one is prepare a very prudent budget, as we've now mentioned numerous times before, and then stick to your production budget. Don't be lured into those bargain purchases or specials that you find along the way. Those are things that sort of fix your expenses at a too high level as well. You must try to keep your expenses as variable as possible, and I've just now said that's quite difficult, right? But a way to potentially do it is to buy all your farming inputs on consignment if it's possible. It means that you will only be paying for what you use. And it may even be worthwhile paying slightly more for your inputs if you have this level of flexibility. Then maybe on a mechanization side, maybe it's possible to rent some of the mechanization or equipment that you require, which is then built on a per hour use basis instead of just buying it outright. Because in that regard, you will also just be paying for the actual usage. And then, like I say, we'll try to avoid those just in case purchases. I only need 10 of these, but maybe I must buy 12 for just in case. That is also something that I think might be a thing to avoid.
I think you've really set some ground rules for us in terms of not being caught in that variable expense trap, Bertie. Is there anything else that you'd like to add in closing before we let you go for this episode of Food for Mzansi TV?
Yes, Dawn, I think it all comes down to the budget. In next episodes, we're going to be talking a bit about more things that ties back to this whole concept of variable expenses. And I think maybe just for the viewers out there, be aware of what you're buying and what the implication of it all is. Do you actually need it? Will you be using it, or is it just a nice to have?
Thank you so much for joining us today, Bertie Hamman, Senior Manager for Agribusiness at Standard Bank. We look forward to our next engagement and enjoy the rest of your day.